minutes. And will, as usual, be followed by a Q&A session. So please be sure to put your questions in the chat session and we will try to get to them. It's a difficult time, but it is my honor to introduce the session's architect and moderator, Professor Natalia Alekshin. Welcome, Natalia. The floor is yours. Unfortunately, due to some technical issues, we may not be able to see Natalia, but it's her words and her scholarship which is most treasurable. Natalia.
Thank you, Elissa, and thank you, Taube Foundation, for providing this important platform. And I apologize that I'm invisible for this conversation, but as invisible as I am honored and thrilled to be here with my visible, wonderful colleagues, friends, and scholars with whom we'll be discussing today Jewish history and culture in Ukraine. And of course, this is all very much in the context of current events. So let me welcome Professor Elissa Bemporad, Professor Mayhill Fowler, Professor Lada Moskalets, and Professor Marta Havryshko. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm waving to you very fervently. And as we have four wonderful minds here, each one with incredible research in the field, I will skip their impressive biographies, read the biographies and read their research when you have a chance, and get to our questions, as it's impossible to really cover all of what we would like to touch on. So let me start with a more general question that touches on your research experience and the way you look back on Jewish culture and history in Ukraine. And you studied Jewish industry, Jewish intellectuals, new cultural institutions, anti-Jewish violence, and the Holocaust, and some of you studied more than one of these topics. So what aspects of this history do you find particularly important, particularly poignant for our understanding of the experience of Jews that lived in what is today, what is contemporary Ukraine, and what makes this history so interesting, important, and maybe unique? I'll start with Mayhill, and I will skip the professorial titles since we are friends, and just call you by your first name. So Mayhill, if you can get us started.
Sure, I will. I would love to get us started on this important question. So, I'm working on cultural institutions, in particular theater, Yiddish, Polish, Ukrainian, Russian theater in the region that is today Ukraine. And I think what's important to grasp is that diversity is a distinctive, that one of the characteristic features of this region is precisely its diversity and multi-ethnicity. And that actually what I found in my research is you kind of can't pull it apart. Right? You can't understand theater if you're only looking at Yiddish theater, or you're only looking at Ukrainian theater, or you're only looking at Russian theater. There's too much exchange, interconnection, interrelatedness. And I think we see that in particular when we were actually trying to come up with the title of this seminar. Is it right. Jewish Ukrainian? Is it Jewish Ukrainian Polish? Well, it's Jewish Ukrainian Polish Russian. Then you'd have to add in the Crimean Tatars, and you'd have to add in the Germans and the Armenians and the Bulgarians. Right. And so that one of the features of this place is its multi-ethnicity. And I think in particular, when we look at culture, we need to realize that it's never just one ethnicity. It's never just two. It's really never just three. It's at least four. And that Ukraine actually offers us a case study of how people live together and apart, right, in ways that are destructive, in ways that are creative, but that it really shows us how important it is to understand diversity. It's never just one ethnicity. So I can start us off with that.
That is a great starting point. So Lada, if you could share with us your take on it.
Thank you. So I am from very different area. I deal with economic history, with social and economic history, and one of the reasons I decided to do it because when you speak about Jews, that's the area that Jews most often interacted with non-Jews. So they lived in towns, in cities, and in villages together with Ukrainians, Poles, and so on, and they had to communicate on everyday basis, and that's when communication in sphere of politics or culture or theater, it appears a little bit later, but on this everyday basis, it appears very early. So I think it's also challenges a lot of our assumptions and stereotypes about Ukrainian Jewish relations if you look in this economic side of the life. And one of my favorite example is Ego document. It's a memoir by Dobar Bolechover, who was from Galicia, from small town Bolechov. And in the end of 18th century, he was wine trader, and he traded wine from Hungary. He brought it from Hungary to Galicia, and he brought it for monasteries, for churches. So he traded with Christians, and he had a lot of adventures because it was a dangerous thing to trade wine. You had to travel across the mountains. You have to deal with dangerous people, and he described it all in his memoir, and it gives you a very different idea of how people communicated one with another. So it inspired me so much. I deal with a little bit different time. I deal with end of 19th century and small industrial town, but it also gives us a different perspective, and it shows us how important is context to understand Ukrainian Jewish or Ukrainian Polish or other combinations of interethnic relations. So that's my point of view. Yes, that's my area, and that's how I see it.
And when you mention a small industrial town, let's just identify it for our listeners, for our co-conversationals.
Yes. So thank you. So Ukraine is a big country right now, yes, but we have different areas. And my research deals with Galicia, which used to be Austro-Hungarian province of Austro-Hungarian Empire. Now it is divided between Ukraine and Poland. And my name of my town is Borislav and Drohobych. That's close to Lviv, Lemberg, and that's in the eastern part of this province of Galicia.
Right, and I think that Mayhill, you alluded to those different imperial contexts, right? The imperial Russian context, and then Lada reminds us of the Austro-Hungarian. But I hope we'll have time to come back to some of those research questions and research findings that you had brought back from the field. But I want to move to Elissa and to Marta and ask about your sense of particularity or lens that Ukraine offers us for modern Jewish history.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to my wonderful panelists. So I've studied quite in depth the unprecedented wave of anti-Jewish violence that was unleashed at the time of the Russian Civil War from 1918 until 1921. We're talking about thousands of pogroms. It took place in more than 800 towns in Stetson, most of them located in Ukraine. As many as 150,000 Jews are killed. Many of the pogroms are carried out by Ukrainian forces fighting against the Red Army, although most of the pogroms are carried out by the white forces, the white movement that is fighting for the return of autocracy. I say this in parenthesis since Putin has redeemed the past and the history of the whites and the white movement. Anyway, studying this history for me has been a reminder of the historic, tragic reality of Ukrainian Jewish relations and anti-Jewish violence in Ukraine over the course of centuries. And of course, the violence occurred on the backdrop of political upheaval, socioeconomic tensions, class tensions, religious stereotypes, but often it found its main source in the divergence between Jewish and Ukrainian political strategies and goals. Jews as a minority group tended to forge alliances with the highest authorities as a survival strategy. The tragedy is that this alliance between Jews and the centers of power was at odds very often with Ukrainians' political goals. Think about the 1648 Khmelnytsky uprising against Polish rule in Ukraine, when Jews are targeted for violence because they are allies of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The same political dynamic takes place in 1768. At the time of the rebellion of Ukrainian peasants and Cossacks against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, when thousands of Jews are massacred in Uman by Ivan Gonta. And this same Jewish strategy of survival plays a role in the Russian Civil War, when Jews eventually side with Soviet power as a lesser of two evils, meaning that it's not so much because of the support of Bolshevism, but it's a reluctant choice driven by the knowledge that by 1919 the Bolsheviks killed relatively few Jews, or stopped killing them altogether compared to other troops, including the Ukrainian troops. Just one thing, studying these pogroms has reminded me that history is not destiny, and that it is possible to break away, and it has been possible to break away from these patterns of historical alliances. And we, over the course of, especially in the post-World War II period, we have great moments of rapprochement between Jews and Ukrainians in terms of political strategies and goals. Think about the dissident movement of the 1970s, when Ukrainians and Jewish dissidents come together and build bridges. And of course, think about, what has happened in Ukraine since 1991, Maidan, and also images of Jews and Ukrainians hiding together in the mikvah in Uman just a few months ago, or Hasidic Jews fighting together side by side with Ukrainians against the Russians. And I'll stop.
Yeah. I mean, this is very important, and we'll come back to it. But let me move the same questions for Marta and her experience as a scholar of the Holocaust.
Thank you so much, Natalia. Thank you, all of you, for coming, for joining us today. I'm very honored to be here with you today. So I believe that my field of expertise, my focus is set. I believe it's very tragic history of violence during World War II, is Holocaust. But I want to say that for me, as a feminist scholar, the most important thing is to describe this gender dimension of the Holocaust. When I made my field work, oral history interviews in Australia, in Melbourne, with the former members of Ukrainian Nationals on the ground, I had one interview with the member of Melnikivtsi, is one of the branch of Ukrainian Nationals on the ground, and he described the pogrom in Borislav, actually, in July 1941. And he described the gender dimension of sufferings of Jewish women and the men. In particular, he described sexual humiliation of pregnant Jewish women. And I was so terrified by this information. And it was clear for me that we have very clear gendered picture and gendered memories about this war. That's why for me as a scholar, very important to bring to light this different gender dimensions of life and death of Jewish women and men on the territory of Ukraine, of today's Ukraine. And in these regards, for me, it's very important to understand how locals interacted with Jews during these difficult times, when we have a lot of stories of friendship and betrayal. We have stories of suffering, and we have stories of aid given. And I want to understand how it was possible, how women, Jewish women and men survived, what particular gender strategies they used for this survival, and how gender shaped their relations with the locals during the Holocaust, and maybe in some way help some people to survive. And for some people, their gender was an additional factor of risk. So yes, this is field of my expertise, and I believe that this is very important, because in different wars, even nowadays, we see that men and women experienced, remember, and narrate war differently. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And it's actually fascinating how it takes us right back to, in a way, to the first question, but I wanted to tease out the choice of lens that you all have in your way of looking at Jewish history and culture in Ukraine. And in particular, this general big collective terms that we use when we talk about, the Jews, the Ukrainian Jews, this and that, were traditional or were secular or were victimized. And if you could talk a little bit more about how microhistory, how local studies, Lada, you alluded to it already with Borisław and Drohobycz, but how family history, how these testimonies, documents of individual people, families, institutions, how they change your perspective on this big story of Jews in Eastern Europe or in Ukraine in particular. So if we can come back, Mayhill, to you.
Sure. So I think one thing that's important for me to say is that I don't consider myself a scholar of Jewish history and culture. I consider myself a scholar of culture in Ukraine, by which I mean you can't understand culture in Ukraine without taking into consideration all the peoples who lived in that territory. And that's a real sort of a shift in thinking that's very hard to kind of grapple with, because so much of our scholarship is divided by nationality, right? That we're looking at Jewish history and culture, we're looking at Ukrainian culture, right? We're looking at Polish culture. And actually, as we know very well, in Eastern Europe, people lived on top of each other, right? It's very hard to separate those issues. And I think one kind of very helpful way to get beyond national categories is biography and is individual lives, because we see how individual lives break scholarly categories, right? People do not conform to the categories that scholars dream up. And so one of the great examples in my work is one street in Kyiv called Prorozhna Street, on which in 1917, 18, 19, you had a Polish theater studio, the Kulturligia's Yiddish drama studio, the young theater of Ukrainian theater innovator Les Kurbas, and a lot of teachers worked at all three studios. It's one block. We kind of imagine all these young people were hanging out at some point, but in their memoirs and their ego documents, people talk about, well, we're focusing on Yiddish theater, or we're focusing on, finally we're doing European style theater in the Ukrainian language. But when you look backstage, you realize actually that there was a lot more interaction and connection and potentially mutual inspiration than perhaps they were acknowledging in their own memoirs. So I think looking at culture demands sort of this multi-ethnic lens. And I think in my latest work, I'm looking at a lot of biographies of women in particular, back to Marta's point, and looking at the ways that women in theater faced a lot of sort of similar problems and similar traumas, similar experiences. And when we look at their life stories, they don't fall neatly into ethnic categories at all, right? And they kind of jump out of these categories. And sort of one big example is Dina Pronicheva, who we know about from her testimony from Babin Yar, right? One of the few survivors of Babin Yar, and her testimony that we can see actually in Loznitsa's Babin Yar context film. But she was an actress. She was a puppet theater actress in Kyiv. both before and after the war. After the trauma of the Holocaust, she went back to work at the Kyiv Puppet Theater. And so she sort of jumps these categories of actress, survivor. She's not working in the Yiddish theater, she's working in the puppet theater, right? So she sort of challenges our stereotypes about theater in Soviet Ukraine. And so looking at a lot of individual life stories, I think shows how we really need to rethink scholarly categories. And I think really think about the region as a category versus nationality or ethnicity.
Yeah, but I think what this example that you just shared with us is so remarkable, because it beyond regional history and then local studies, then we go even closer, even more intimate into the actual space, right? A building,
exactly.
A street, the whole question of being neighbors. And it was striking what you said earlier, how we can't divide it, and yet for so long these are separate histories, as if these streets were on a different plane. So
Exactly.
it's really remarkable. And Lada, I don't want to push you into sharing with us your research on Drahobic and Borisov, but if you would, that would be absolutely wonderful. And that particular aspect of looking at industrialists and economic lens.
Thank you. Yeah, so my research was all about microhistories, because I research elites, Jewish elites living in this particular industrial town, people who became wealthy because of their involvement in oil industry. And it became very interesting experience for me, because I met a lot of descendants of people whom I researched in my dissertation, and they told me family stories, family legends, myths, and so on. And so I had this family stories and had also autobiographies and things like this, which challenged a lot of my assumptions. And one particular example was. And also on the other hand, because I deal with 19th century, and that the century which had this abundance of sources, especially newspapers. And I had a lot of newspapers, mostly I had Polish newspapers in German, in Yiddish, in Hebrew, and I looked through them. And this perspective on one person could be very different in the newspapers, which depicted some industrialist as evil person who is ruling the city, who is corrupted, and so on, like very similar to what you can see in our current newspapers. And so I read about this corruption, how they said the Jewish elites are communicating with Polish elites, and they are all ruling over our town. It was very, very funny, like some kind of conspiracy theories in the newspapers. And then I saw these autobiographies, and one of the men, his name was Asher Zelig Lauterbach. He was very wealthy, and but he was also a very philosophical man, I would say. He had a traditional religious education, and he wrote his autobiography in Hebrew, and it was published in one important collection of autobiographies by Nahum Sokolov. And it was, so he was an oil entrepreneur. He was very rich, and the factory had his name. And he mentioned in his 5 pages of autobiography, he mentions one paragraph, he mentions oil, because it was not important for him. What was important, it was his activity as a man of thought, as a man who can exchanges letters with important thinkers of his time. And it was very interesting for me, and it was difficult to put together these two narratives, yes. And also, but I wouldn't say that family history and autobiographies also has some meta-narrative over them, and it also has some how they are written. They are also written according to some to some plot, yes, to some bigger ideas. And I think the best historians are literary scholars, philologists, people who have first education as philologists and then they switch to history, so they can read and they can understand how the story is constructed and they can understand it the best. I was only learning because I guess when person is writing his or her dissertation, it's still a process of learning. But it was very interesting, and it was interesting not only for me as a researcher, but also for me as a human being, to see so many different perspectives of one person.
I hope we might have time for this. I would be very interested in actually asking you about the expectations and the meta narratives that you brought to the field when you first entered it. But let's leave it on a side for maybe when there is time left. And Elissa, if you could share with you some of those local, family, micro-historical, individual kind of eye openings for you.
Yes, thank you, Natalia. And just to pick up from Mayhill's and Vlada's excellent comments, I would like to actually start by saying that in general, I don't think that we can talk about an exceptionalism of Jewish history more than we can talk about an exceptionalism of Ukrainian history, Polish history. In other words, all national history tends really to create homogeneous and rather, I would say, artificial ideas of the people, of the nation, of its past. That then leads us to think about them in collective terms. That being said, in terms of methodologies that can help us rethink Jewish history, specifically in Ukraine, and disengage it from this kind of collective and communal conception. For me, what has been the most useful category of historical analysis, I would say, is the local history, the micro history, just like Lada to some extent. It has helped me move away from the centrality of the state and the empire, right? The Russian Empire, the Soviet state vis-a-vis the Jews, and really this over focus on the Russian Empire and the Soviet Empire has fed into this idea of the Jews as a homogeneous and uniform entity. So in other words, I think that the possibility that we have to rethink the Jewish experience through the lens of regional, local history, and really appreciate regional identities, local identities, is what I appreciate the most in my own work, right? And disengaging with this idea of collectivity. I've also used extensively in terms of categories of historical analysis class that I think breaks away from, again, this narrow collective communal idea of Jewish history. Jewish and Ukrainian workers who share much more than Jews who belong to other class groups. Gender, I've worked not only on the question of rape and sexual violence against Jewish women, but also on the question of rescuing Jewish women and coexistence and resistance to this violence in 1919, 1920, or I'm in the process of working on this through gender, meaning that you have these these attempts to create micro bridges between Jews and Ukrainians via gender. So Jewish and Ukrainian women who help each other in the context of the violence of the Civil War. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Elissa. And I know we could listen for much longer. Marta, if you could add to that micro, you shared already with us this one particular interview that was so important for you. But is this how your research really moves forward through these individual encounters?
I want to say that study of sexual violence is all about microhistory, actually. And dealing with this topic, I actually following the recent developments on approaching the sexual violence in war and genocide and armed conflicts. And maybe our audience is aware about this discussion about the Murad Code. And the main idea of this Murad Code is victim or survivor-centered approach to gathering testimonies about conflict-related sexual violence. So the Holocaust in general gives us many examples of women's suffering, gender suffering during the Holocaust. And one particular example, Clara from Bar, she was only 13 years old when she was raped by the chief of local police in October 1942. And her story is, for me, is a very vivid example of this survival-centered approach. Because through her story, through her personal accounts that she gave to Soviet authorities in 1960s, we see how this child experienced sexual abuse during the Holocaust, what effects of this sexual abuse she experienced, immediate effects and long-term effects. She actually experienced difficulties in family life with her husband. She had the nightmares. She had a lot of difficulties caused by this traumatic experience. And her story is very vivid for me, how woman is seeking for strength to break this silence and to say her story in order to set an example for other women who can't break the silence, and they are living in this trauma of silence. But her story is very important for us as researchers, because we have very obviously politicization of her personal sufferings, and we see how Soviets actually instrumentalize her story in order to aim their political goals, in order to portray these high-rank Nazi helpers as brutal killer, rapist, and offender. But so we have many dimensions in one particular story, and other stories are very important for me because they actually help us to understand the nature of this intimate violence. When many women and girls were begging their perpetrators not to rape them because they knew them. They even used those nicknames. Senka, for example, yes, Arseny, the full name is Arseny. They ask those people who turn into policemen or local perpetrators, and they use, this language to ask them to just to save their life and not to harm them. So we see this nature of the sexual violence during the Holocaust, actually, especially perpetrated by locals, is a very good example, and every story is a very vivid example of this intimate, let's say, violence, how former neighbors, classmates, friends turned into sex offenders and perpetrators, and what were the consequences of this violence, because many women, we know, after the end of the World War II, were living next to their perpetrators, and they can approach NKVD or KGB because the shame, of the whole situation prevent them from do that. So my research is all about microhistory and personal stories, which are very, very important.
It's amazing how it ties in a way, Mayhill, to this image of one street. In the case, again, you told us about it's a happy example of multi-cultural coexistence, and that professional identity, right? Being an actor or a dancer that overrides identities, but it's also one street that can have a very different meaning. And I'm extremely tempted to ask you, Elissa, in particular about the aftermath of that wave of violence that you studied, that wave of pogroms. If you can just give us a tiny sense of it in light of what Marta told us, and then we'll move to the question of politics today and research.
So the impact of anti-Jewish violence on the relations between Jews and Ukrainians in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. I mean, of course, there are variations, again, to piggyback on what has been said already. It depends on, we don't want to say the Jewish reaction, right? It depends on gender, age group, where Jews lived at the time. But I would say in general that the response was very often to side with the state, side with the Soviet state, which had outlawed anti-Semitism, at least on paper, and in theory promised protection from anti-Semitism and pogroms. And siding with the state, of course, had an impact on Jewish-Ukrainian relations. The response on the part of Jews, of course, also had expressed itself by resettling elsewhere, right? Leaving the towns and shtetl of Ukraine and moving to Moscow and Leningrad, so fleeing these cities of death, and this also had an impact, I would say, on the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians. What is missing, I think, is an understanding of the responsibility of the state, of the totalitarian system, which in a way interfered with the memory of violence. It did not allow for a processing of the trauma and the memory of this violence. On the one hand, by encouraging the identification of Ukrainians with nationalists, a negative identification, and potentially anti-Semites throughout the interwar period in the 20s and 30s. And by the same token, not openly discussing the problem of anti-Semitism. Despite this commitment to do so on paper, the state, chose when to ignore anti-Semitism. And all this really has an impact on a long-term impact on the relations between Jews and Ukrainians, encourage these tensions as opposed to overcoming them, the state, that is.
It's fascinating, just the conversation, as it were, between what Marta just said about Clara, right, and kind of mobilizing that particular case of violence and the desire of the survivor to speak by the bigger political agenda, and what Elissa, what you share. Lada, I just wonder if for your research on Drohobych and Borisław, and not following per se the wave of pogroms that Elissa is studying, do you see the impact of violence in the lives of that particular class of people?
Well, industrial city in 19th century was like a place of violence by itself, but it was a different kind of violence. It was mostly fights between different workers. At the beginning of our discussion, I said about importance of context, and people, Jews in Boryslaw, they lived in unusual for them context. So they didn't live in the small trading towns. They didn't live in the villages. They lived in new industrial place, and so they used these tools of violence also by themselves in 19th century. And we have a very interesting event in Boryslaw, which was called Boryslaw War in 1884, when Jewish workers attacked Christian workers, and it was very, very different. So very interesting to talk about. But we have also a wave of anti-Jewish violence, which happened during World War I, and it impacted very much rich people, wealthy magnates, who ran away, who moved to Vienna as like, which was supposed to be a safer place than Drohobych, and some of them didn't return back to Drohobych, to Galicia, and they stayed in Vienna, but some of them returned. And here we see how this class is important, because these people could live because they had money, they had connections. When they moved to Vienna, they didn't live on a train station. They lived in villas and in beautiful houses in the center of the city. And some. I was also surprised that I have a lot of my heroes of my PhD. They managed to survive Holocaust because they had these resources to get away from Europe when they felt that it's dangerous, and so it's a little bit different experience when we speak about those
Right.
kids.
A unique lens in a way. So the time is running out, and we want to be able to take questions from our wonderful audience. Let me move to the direct question of politics and the current war. So if you could share with us, how do you think this current war, in light of Russian propaganda, the references to World War II, the mobilization and misuse of historical narratives, how does it, how maybe already now is changing, maybe affecting your research? I think it's particularly poignant in a case of World War II and the Holocaust, but quite possibly also beyond. And I want to start with two of our wonderful panelists, with Lada and Marta, who I should add are not only scholars and university educators and teachers, but also they are refugee scholars, right? Lada, you're speaking from Warsaw, and Marta, you're in Basel, and you're there because of what's going on. So how do you think this is affecting the field and your research? Lada, if can we start with you?
I can start. So yes, I mean, this word refugee scholar. So yes, in one way I am, because I moved from Lviv because of the war, but on the other hand, I am a little bit like my oil magnates. I had a place where I could come because my husband is Polish, so I could move to Warsaw and I can live here. I can stay how long I need, and so I feel privileged comparing to my colleagues from Kharkiv who had to leave because they had to leave, but of course I feel this like this huge change and huge transformation of what's happening to Jewish scholars and to scholars in Ukraine in general. And I feel we right now we experience so much support from our colleagues and from other different institutions and universities. And I feel like when I moved here, I was like, I still have my job, my Ukrainian job, so I was just working, doing teaching at my university, and every day I received like few offers, like please, we have this scholarship and that scholarship. Perhaps you wanna join? And it was amazing. It was very important. And on the other hand, I felt the need to listen voice of Ukrainian scholars, especially scholars who deal with Ukrainian Jewish relations, because it was one of these hot themes. And one of the things which I was very important for personally for me, last week I had a lecture at National Library of Israel, and I didn't have in Jerusalem. I had it from here by Zoom, but it was also very important that National Library of Israel pays attention that there are Ukrainian scholars, that they want to listen to voice of Ukrainian scholars. And there are people who deal with Jewish, there are quite a few people who deal with Jewish studies, and I feel that we are being more noticed right now. And I hope, like, I am a little bit, I hope it will, that people, that this demand will go not only for these themes of violence and suffering, about culture, about social history, about interactions and so on, because it's also very important, because to understand violence and to understand 20th century, you need to go back and you need to understand the history in general. And I think in this moment I'm very optimistic about a field of Jewish studies. But also I'm from Lviv, and I'm now in a safe place. But we have universities which are being destroyed. We have scholars who have no job, and perhaps they right now they can live on the scholarships, but in a year perhaps they will understand that they cannot survive being university professors, and they will move to other area, and they will become I don't know, go to IT industry or something like this. So we don't know. It depends on how long and how we will react. So right now we are taking these opportunities we can, but the damage is also which is being done.
Right. Lada, I think you became muted. But Marta, would you talk about your experience? And I think yours is particularly sensitive with the kind of questions you're asking and research you're doing. Thank you, Lada.
Natalia, let me briefly return to our previous question about the impact of anti-Jewish violence on Ukraine-Jewish relations. I want to stress, I conducted dozens of interviews with witnesses and victims of World War II. And I noticed that this anti-Jewish violence actually impacted heavily and still impact local communities. Many of members of this community had these stories about involvement of locals in this violence, and they feel shame and guilt. And some of them even are trying to make up some stories about rescuing. One of the story I heard during my field work in Podhaitsi, for example, in Ternopil region. And when I was trying to clarify, because it was very amazing story, I learned from other people there that this family actually, they report the Jews, not so they use them, Jewish family, in order to earn some money from occupiers. That's why I believe this story is still impacting heavily Ukrainian society. That's why we need this very open discussion and very open conversation about inconvenient past, about these very difficult questions. And I believe that this war will bring us a chance to build more inclusive history, where Jewish heritage, Jewish culture will have a very, very important place. Because now we observe how many people with Jewish background explicitly they show their Jewish identity. They joined Ukraine armed forces, and they joined the war efforts because for them Ukraine is their home country. And I want to believe that after the end of this war, we will not discuss we will have a discussion in our society about, No, I believe that we will have many more discussion about anti-Semitism, because I was very upset actually when the numerous menorahs were damaged by some, by some people in the previous fall. And I believe that we as a society, our intellectuals, should raise their voices against those examples of anti-Semitism. And I believe that this work could bring us a chance to build more inclusive memory and history about World War II. And another my point, I want to stress that we as Holocaust scholars and Holocaust educators should pay more attention to the question of Holocaust distortion, because we see that the history of the Holocaust is now manipulated and instrumentalized in order to achieve political goals, in order to justify war crimes and crimes against humanity. Our task is to raise this question, to deal with this, to teach our students how to recognize hate speech, how to recognize anti-Semitism, how to recognize the lie, actually. And I believe that if we will develop the courses, for example, more courses about the history and memory of the Holocaust and World War II in our universities, it will help us to deal with difficult questions in the future. Thank you so much.
To that. Thank you, Marta. I know that, Elissa, your presence means we should now move to questions, but let me just give one sentence to Mayhill and to Elissa to that question, and then I surrender to you the microphone. Elissa.
Here I am. I agree entirely with what Marta said, and that was one of the points that I was getting at. There was no open discussion, not surprisingly, in the Soviet context of the 1920s and 30s about the anti-Jewish violence that took place during the Civil War, and that the relationship between Jews and Ukrainians suffered because of that. Just two things. First of all, I think it is our responsibility as historians to really use our skills, our profession, to counter the lies that are coming from Moscow with all the strength that we have. I've been reading a lot the work that is helpful to me, the work of the great writer Vasily Grossman, who wrote this extraordinary novel, Life and Fate, about World War II, the Holocaust, and the Soviet totalitarian system, who really kind of is a reminder of the fact that to speak the truth to power, to wrest language away from the regime, is really to resist these lies that are coming from Moscow. I think that we have to support as much as we can scholars who work on the Holocaust, especially in Ukraine, those scholars who are working on the question of collaboration. This goes back to what Marta was saying about open conversation. And just the last point that I want to make, there's a lot of discussion about the question of genocide. What is happening now? Is it genocide? And I just want to say that I'm in agreement with those who say that this is genocide based on intent, mass rape, deportation, cultural crimes, and so on. And I think it is important for us also to think about parallels and similarities between what happened during the Holocaust in Ukraine and what is happening now in Ukraine, questions of cultural resistance, for example. But of course, we need to keep in mind the different contexts, also the differences between the conditions of Jews during the Shoah in Ukraine and the conditions of everyone in Ukraine now during this war. So context is crucial. Okay,
Mayhill, just one and a half sentence.
Okay, well, God. I would say, one, there's an epistemological challenge right now for Soviet history that I really feel. Two, continuity is a danger. I think as often the general public wants to make a continuity between Russian Empire, Soviet Union, post-Soviet Russia today. And I think as historians, as my co-panelists are saying, it's very important to find the context, to find the differences, to not fall back on continuity, but to really look at what's specific about the situation today. I would also say that the silences in the archives are screaming right now. And at least for me as a scholar in my work, what is painful is the ways that trauma doesn't show up in the archive, kind of referring back to one of Marta's comments before, that a lot of the trauma that my actresses underwent in the Holocaust, in other experiences of World War II under occupation, does not show up anywhere in the archives or in memoirs. And yet, of course, they're carrying that trauma with them onto the stage where they're telling stories every night. And so I think I feel like it's my responsibility, at least, to try to at least articulate those silences and speak to those silences. And I always think that as historians, we need to figure out what voices we're not hearing, right? And try to hear those voices. I would say, yes, we need to hear Ukrainian voices. We need to encourage Ukrainian scholars and institutionalize Ukrainian history. It can't just be sort of one fellowship for one person. We have to get over the Russia-dominated field of Slavic studies and focus on diversity, on difference, on difficult conversations, on unpacking empire, and really thinking about the violence that empire has wrought on our world and on the field. So there's more than 1.5 sentences, but that's the best I can do.
Thank you. Thank you.
So I don't want to interrupt this conversation, especially, first of all, what you started with, and Natalia, how you framed the questions, each of you speaking to a particular, and then moving to this universal issue, which I think we're all very curious about. So in a sense, you've already started to address two of the questions that we've been that have shared. They have shared with us, our audience, and we thank you very much. Let me just put them up on the screen, and I suggest that we have the possibility of coming back. Each of you are raising such crucial issues about how the present, what the present does with the past. So let me just start with this question, or this comment. At the moment, the historical narratives of the past and their challenges have been almost suspended. And what you spoke about, and I'm adding my paraphrase here, is that this is the time that we need to act and to persevere. And yet the present does not change the past. As scholars, how do you envision an expanded meta-narrative? I open it up to Elissa, to Marta, to Mayhill, to Lada, and of course to Natalia.
I would say just very briefly, I think the present does change the past, actually, because we only know the past through ourselves as scholars in the present. And we're always reading the past through the present, which is a weird thing to think about, but I think it's true. And I was just saying this sort of epistemological challenge of Soviet history. I mean, that, I've spent my career trying to find nuance in the totalitarian state. And now it seems like, well, gosh, maybe it really is just all about violence. I don't think it is. I think it is more complex, but I think that to think that we can ever be completely objective as scholars is great hubris. And I think we always have to realize how the questions that shape our world today shape how we see the past.
I'll jump in and I'll say that I agree with Mayhill entirely. And I've been influenced a lot. I've been reading a lot. Historian E. Carr, who actually says that if you want to understand the work of the historian, you have to read the newspapers. You have to read what is happening in the present. And I think that as far as I'm concerned, I've seen a lot in the work of the witness accounts of the anti-Jewish violence during the Civil War. The focus, understandably so, on the trauma, on the violence carried out by neighbors. And only, but forgetting or not including in those accounts cases in which neighbors helped because of the trauma. And then historians read those accounts and focus also only on that trauma. So I think that, the war that is happening now has is shaping a little bit the way in which I approach these witness accounts from 1919, 1920. And I'm really trying to find bridges, which are there, that, as historians, we just have to be very careful and we have to look for them. And I think we will find them.
Władysława, would you like to add something?
Yes, I think war is definitely shaping and changing my experience, which was my very short experience being in a country during the war, my long experience of observing everything from Warsaw. It changed how I perceive the sources, the primary sources, memoirs, diaries about from Holocaust or from other traumatic events. But I will honestly say that during the first 2 months, I could not do it. I could not read anything about related to the war. I had a big thing that I make myself work, but I'm slowly coming back to it, and I feel like I understand better these people from the past, but I'm not sure I'm happy about it. It's a very hard experience.
Thank you, Władysława. Sorry that we seem to be losing you, but thank you for sharing that. Marta, and then Natalia.
Yes, thank you so much. Actually, I agree with the point of Mayhill. Present really changed the past. Actually, our both individual and collective memory about the past. And we see how Putin's Russia changed its past. They actually made up the new history of World War II. Where no place for Ukrainians as Red Army soldiers, those who liberated Auschwitz and other places. There are no place for Ukraine culture, only appropriation by Russia. So we see how actually memory politics changed the past. And its representations and our memory about the past. On the contrary, in the past years in Ukraine, I see how new memory politics actually change also Ukraine past. Because maybe you noticed this parade on the anniversary of Ukraine independence. And it was created, some video was created, and the major part of this video was devoted to Baban Yar and the tragedy as
hopefully we'll come back to Marta. Natalia, if you could
yes,
add.
I'm thinking frantically aloud because this is such a wonderful question and such a provocative question at the same time, and I think I'm somewhere halfway to where Mayhill and Elissa declared themselves to be, and maybe what I will say is somewhat personal, which is a realization that I didn't have until now, how much present is the past, meaning how much the past lives in the present and is vulnerable for abuse. And reading a kind of twisted quote of my colleague Javi Dreyfus, a historian from Tel Aviv University, that was semi-quoted in the statement by the Russian Foreign Ministry following that terrible interview on the Italian television. You suddenly realize that people doing research for the statement were frantically looking for a quote from a Jewish historian that would say something about Jewish collaboration. And so you realize that not only, I agree, we are very much our sensitivities, our kind of ears for hearing those voices, for hearing the silences, for seeing how the past is constructed in our sources. I think aside from this, we also see a great responsibility for what we are writing.
I'm sorry that we have to bring our time together to a close. I feel that there are many threads here that we should come back to, because the other question, and we'll just throw it out there, but it's one I think that plagues all of us, before I thank you, is that when we describe the street, and there's so many streets in our histories, we allude to the relationship among neighbors. Neighbors can be antagonistic, friendly, or indifferent. And for the next time we meet, as you all dig deeper into the areas that you cover, the question remains, how does a quiet neighbor become a violent enemy? But I don't want to end on that note. First of all, I would like to thank each and every one of you. I would like to say, listening to you, I believe our audience, the comments are, people are intrigued and very grateful to have had you. I sense also that this is the beginning, Natalia, of many more conversations that you will grow and tend to.
With camera on.
With camera on, and with technical difficulties behind us. So thank you. I want to thank you all for your time and your scholarly work and your insights and being so honest. This session, we had a technical difficulty in the beginning, but this session is really dedicated to Ukrainian scholars and to the work that you continue to do. And may you find safe havens for the temporary time until you can return home and our conversations can continue from home. So I want to thank also our very patient audience. We're very happy to be back with you. We apologize again for any of the technical difficulties. Please do join us next month as we continue TJHT Talks. And for those of you who have already and continue to support our efforts to assist Ukrainian refugees in Poland, we really want to share our gratitude. You make a difference, and we do our best to make sure the difference has a major impact. So to all of you, again, thank to Natalia for moderating, and to all of you for responding and engaging. I want to say good night from Warsaw, and let us meet in a free Ukraine. Dobranoc. Good night. Thank you.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.